From when we are very young, we already see the early yearnings for fairness. The justice system in any society is really intended to maintain some sense of fairness, law and order. We know from history and from our contemporary experience that when the powerful abandon any sense of fairness in society, terrible suffering happens. We know slavery is a result of that. Concentration camps were a result of that. Marie Antoinette was a result of that. Fairness matters deeply. However, it is also true that life is unfair. Some people really do suffer more than others in the course of a lifetime. There are others in life who prosper when they really, really don't deserve to. And we know too well that corrupt leaders often escape real justice. In my own life, I have witnessed families endure the most extraordinary sequence of tragedy and pain. Just real, extraordinary pain on top of pain. And then at the same time, I've also seen other families who have lived mostly charmed lives, abundant in opportunities, comfortable with their material comforts, and surrounded mostly by apparently really good relationships. Some families just seem to have it good and others seem to suffer deeply. And there are various reasons, which is beyond the scope of our sermon today, but there are various reasons why I think we yearn for fairness. But let me make this one observation, that at least one of the reasons we yearn for fairness is because there's so much unfairness around us. We long for a world to be fair. However, if we were honest, and I think if we give it careful thought, and I hope you will give it careful thought, I wonder if we would want a life which is perfectly fair all the time, in every way. I mean, one of my questions is, who of us really deserves all that we have? If we were treated fairly, perhaps some of us would have a lot less in every way than what we already have. The message of Easter, of course, which we've just celebrated, is that all of us received what we didn't deserve, or to put it differently, that we didn't receive what we did deserve. It may just be that fairness all the time in every situation isn't necessarily the best thing for us. Today we visit another story in the life of David, because last week's was so much fun. This time David and his men are off helping King Achish on a military campaign. And so they leave their women and children back in the settlement at Ziklag. And while they're gone, a raiding band of Amalekites, who had it in for the Israelites a lot, they come and attack that settlement with the women and children. They ransack the place, they steal everything, and they capture the women and children and they take them off. When David returns from battle, their village is now nothing but a burning ember. And the first instincts of David's men is to take out their rage on David. They have murderous thoughts. Why did you take us away to go and fight a battle and leave our women and children unprotected? One moment he's their hero, the next they want to kill him. One moment he's not just their hero, he's their brother, literally in the Lord, and he's their friend, and now they want to kill him. We human beings can be funny like that, eh? By contrast, we read that David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. It's a beautiful verse, 1 Samuel 36. I wondered if this wasn't, this reaction of David's, if this wasn't God's work in and through him because of his interaction with Abigail. Because in the midst of this terrible tragedy, and it was a terrible tragedy, he's been betrayed in some ways by his men wanting to kill him. David doesn't retaliate. That old instinct that he had last week to kill Nabal for denying them a feast, that instinct has gone now. Instead, David prays. He goes and seeks counsel. He worships. Made me think of that line from one of my favorite hymns, change and decay and all around I see, O thou who changest not, abide with me. I imagine David could have prayed that in that moment. While the men are planning murder, David is off seeking God's heart. And then it's a commendable thing, a commendable, I suppose, posture of leadership, that David is now able to persuade his troops to follow him at all. They're tired from battle, they're angry and anxious about the destruction of their village, and they're mistrusting of David's judgments about having to take them off and all the tragedy that happened. But nevertheless, they restore some measure of confidence in David, I suppose, and they march to go and look for the Amalekite marauders. If nothing else, I guess, just to go and find the women and children would have motivated them. Archaeological research suggests that the distance that they travel is about 25 kilometers when they come across a little stream, a brook. Besor is the name of the brook. David has 600 men with him, and we get told that 200 of that 600, 1/3 of them, decide when they reach that little stream that they've had enough. They kind of go thus far and no further. We don't have the strength, and not only do we not have the strength, we don't have the spirit to continue, they say. And so they sit down beside the cool stream, and they leave the others to go off on the search, to go and look for the women and the children and perhaps some bounty. A little while later, those 400 who are now on the search, they stumble upon an Egyptian. And if one's honest, it's a peculiar thing to stumble upon in the middle of nowhere, but they do. And this Egyptian was the worse for wear. The scriptures tell us that they gave him, these 400, give the Egyptian bread, and he ate. They gave him water to drink. They also gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins. When he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. He was famished and dehydrated. Now what had happened was that he was a servant to the Amalekites. The Egyptian was a servant to the Amalekites. Those are the people who had attacked David's village. And the Egyptian had become ill, and it seems that the Amalekite method of medicine was simply to abandon you and leave you to die. You were an encumbrance, so they just toss you out of the caravan, as it were. So when David asked whether the Egyptian might know where the Amalekites would be hiding or where they would be going, the Egyptian said, "I'll tell you, as long as you promise not to give me back to the Amalekites when you find them." He would gladly help. One thing he wanted to do was have nothing more to do with the Amalekites. So the deal is set. And off they go and they find the place. And the Amalekites are inebriated by their successes, and they're filled with food and wine after all their many plunderings, and they're just confident in their hiding place. No one will find us here. And so they put up no security measures. And so it's easy for David and his men to attack. And they attack early in the morning, and the battle lasted until that evening. And we're told, it's a funny phrase, but we're told that no one escaped except for 400 young men on camels. 400 seems like quite a big group to describe as no one, but you know what I mean. Anyway, we assume that if those are the 400 who do manage to escape, that the rest didn't make it. It would have been a devastating battle for the Amalekites. The miracle of it all is that after all of that, every woman and child from David's group was found safe. So David and his men gathered up all the bounty the Amalekites had plundered on their campaign, not just from their place, but from all the other places they had pillaged. And they gather all that up, which would have been flocks and possessions and stuff. They gather it all up and they take it home with them. And when they arrive back at the brook Besor, the 200 tired men rise to go and meet them, which would have been a common practice of the day, to greet your king, as it were, when he arrives. And then there's this wonderful little thing. I'll talk about it again in a moment, but there's this wonderful little moment that we're told as David meets them and they meet David, David salutes them. Just remember that for a moment. David salutes them. But amongst the 400 who had gone off to go and look for the women and children are some who the scriptures call, rather scathingly, the corrupt and worthless fellows. And they are described as that because they complain. Their first words were to kind of go, these guys never came with us. They don't get to partake in the spoils of war. They can have their wives and children, but that's it. We don't want to honor them. What would be fair is that they just get the basics. What would be fair is that they just get the essentials. But David is clear, everyone is going to receive the same portion, whether they stayed behind or whether they went to war. Whether you are a worthless complaining fellow or whether you are gracious, everyone gets the same thing. And David's reasoning is simply because everything we have gained has been a gift from the Lord. It was God who preserved us. It was God who guided us. And so this bounty is really not ours. We are just agents of God's provision for everyone. For everyone. So I wonder if I could just shine a light onto three things. I hope you'll make more of it than I make of it in this word, that you'll ponder it and do something good with it for yourself. But let me make these observations. Firstly, let me remind you, there's a bumper sticker, sort of meme if you like, that goes, be kind to everyone, because some people are fighting battles you know nothing about. In David's army, everyone's experience, in fact, had been strikingly similar. Everyone had been to battle. Everyone's wife and child, as it were, had been taken. On the surface, everyone had lost similarly. And yet we know from human experience, we know that people are different, and people are differently able, and people are differently resilient. And so in this moment, those 200 couldn't do any more. And the reality is that all of us at one time or another in life end up at the brook of Besor. All of us end up tired and weary in life. All of us need compassion. All of us at one time or another need understanding. And on this particular day, it was those 200 men. Walter Brueggemann, the wonderful scholar, observes that in the time of Jesus, compassion was not permitted as a regular part of the function of society. He says it's also true of the Egyptian society, because compassion would undermine the power structures of the day. You couldn't show compassion on people because that would be seen as weakness. And so Brueggemann goes on to say that the compassion of Jesus, therefore, wasn't simply an act of love, but it was also a critique. It was a criticism of the way the world works. Therefore, kindness, compassion, is countercultural in our world. Simple acts of kindness are the undoing of the wrongness of the way our world is structured. So the first thing I leave you with today is, as David was, be kind. Be kind. The second light I want to shine, if I might, notwithstanding what I've said above, because this is going to sound like I'm contradicting what I've said, but I'm not, because these two things can be true next to each other. And the reality is this, that in our world there just are some people who are happy for other people to do the work. It just is. It just is. And maybe all of us go through that phase. But in every context, you see it. I see it in church. I see it all over the place. There just are some people who are happy for others to do the work. And again, I'd encourage you to give thought to this, because this has to do with labor. It has to do with government. It has to do with our families. It has to do with our friendships. It has to, as I said, with church. Just give it some thought. There's significance in this observation, that there are some who are happy for others to do the work. That attitude is the opposite of compassion. It's the opposite of kindness, to deliberately leave others to do the work. I remember with some embarrassment, many, many years ago now, I was living in Johannesburg, and I went on holiday with some friends. One of the guys had a boat, and we actually came down to Kenton, here in the Eastern Cape. And for about 4 or 5 days, we went up and down the river, exploring and skiing. And it was only on the last day that I realized that I had never offered to pay for petrol once. And I then discovered that others had been doing so through the week. It had never dawned on me. And the reason it hadn't dawned on me is because there just are some people who are happy for others to do the work. And I was one of those on that trip. The truth is, Jesus taught his followers an ethic of service. I want us to understand that Jesus taught his followers an ethic of service. You cannot serve Jesus at the same time as having an attitude of letting others do the work. To follow Jesus is to choose a life of service. To follow Jesus is to embrace a life of being responsible. The third light I want to shine, and then we'll be done. It's kind of the whole story summed up, really, but I want to mention it in this way. And I want to say, nurture a generous spirit. Nurture a generous spirit. I was moved by the little vignette, I mentioned it earlier in the story, when David comes back to the brook and the 200 guys who had stayed behind come to meet him. He salutes them. He honors them. He's not angry at them. There are no hard feelings here. He doesn't have an attitude of you should be grateful for what we've done for you. He salutes them. He goes, it's good to see you. Thank you for your honoring of me, and I honor you. It's a generous spirit. And then when those guys who are described as being corrupt and worthless, they complain and they don't want to share, David remains firm. Everyone is going to receive an equal share. The complainers, the lazy, the tired, everyone is included. Everyone is welcome. It's a generous spirit. It's a generous spirit. And David's generosity is rooted in this one single idea that everything he has is a gift from God. Not just material possessions, his life. Everything he has is a gift from God. And I want to say, when we think generosity, I think most of us do, we think largely in terms of material stuff. But generosity is not really first and foremost about material things. Generosity is fundamentally a state of the heart. It's a state of the heart. It's what's in your spirit. It's what's in your heart. That's where generosity comes from. And David's heart, we see in this story, is a generous heart. Nurture for yourself a generous heart. We close with a little snippet that we didn't read in our reading today. When David eventually gets back to Ziklag, back home as it were, he takes a portion of his proceeds that was given to him. He does appear to keep some for himself, but he takes a good portion of his own proceeds and he goes and distributes them to towns all over Israel, places that they had visited before. He just goes to bless them. It's a generous spirit. Kindness, service, and generosity. May they be yours. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.